Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today I wanted to talk about a vegetable that is very much underappreciated. There's not a lot of varieties that are out there to buy, and I'm talking today about celery root or celeriac. There's a couple of varieties that are available to grow from some of the sort of medium to bigger seed companies, Giant Prague, Mars and Brilliant, which I really love the name of because I say brilliant quite a lot. But this year I'm growing a variety called Monarch. So there's not a lot of varieties that are out there, not like, your tomatoes and stuff where there's just hundreds and hundreds of different varieties that are available, or lettuce. And I was kind of disappointed. I was looking through the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook this year, and there was no celeriac in there. There was plenty of different celery varieties, but nothing for celeriac. And for those of you that listen quite often, you know how I like to grow different varieties of plants. I like to create different varieties that are going to thrive well here on my homestead. But I also love to do my part to help preserve heirloom seeds, and I like to help grow them out. I like to try and adapt them to the climate that I have here in Maine. I want to help preserve some of these varieties, but there's just not a lot for celeriac, and there's not a lot of choice either. And unfortunately, this vegetable is one where seed companies often drop them. So, you'll see them one year in the catalogue, and then, the next it's gone. And it's likely due to the fact that it's not popular for gardeners to buy, and it's not something that's profitable for that company to keep growing and keep in stock for people. So I wanted to tell you about this vegetable to bring celeriac out of the seeds to drop list and into the light and into the garden. Now, if you're wondering what on earth the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook is, it's basically it's different to the catalogue of seeds that Seed Savers Exchange has, right, that you can get on the list and get sent out, right? The yearbook is a list of all the seeds and, Skyonwood or Psyonwood, however you pronounce it, that's available, and it's available to swap through the exchange. So there's, Seed Savers Exchange, but then they have this other section called the Exchange, and that's where gardeners can share and swap different varieties of whether it's heirloom fruits, vegetables, flowers, grains, herb seeds, and wood for trees and grafting and stuff like that. It's a huge resource, and it's an amazing resource. And I actually get the yearbook as part of having a membership with Seed Savers Exchange. This isn't a sponsored post or a sponsored blog, or podcast or anything like that from Seed Savers Exchange. This is just a resource that I use every single year, and not a lot of people seem to know about it. And it's a huge resource that's available to you, and it's not something that is just for the US either. There's other countries that are part of the exchange, so definitely check it out. I use it now to find varieties that are unique to the northeast of the US, but I also looked for varieties that thrived in the Rockies when I lived out west. So I use it to really look for seeds that are either being grown within the same region that I am, and there's not a lot for Maine, or I'm using it to look for varieties that are heirloom within the area that I'm living. Now, growing heirlooms from your region is always going to be best, right? They're adapting to your climate, the weather, soil, pest pressures and disease, right? If you're wanting to create your own varieties of seeds, whether that's land races or just being able to save seeds that grow well in your garden, starting with open pollinated varieties and heirloom seeds is going to be the easier route for a novice seed saver. And the exchange that's done through Seed Savers Exchange is a wonderful resource for any gardener. So if you haven't checked it out, then you should. You don't need to have a Seed Savers Exchange membership to use the exchange. The membership's got a bunch of other benefits with it, so you can check that out. Again, this isn't sponsored by Seed Savers Exchange. I'm just sharing a resource that I use all the time to help. And I really like just looking at the sheer variety of seeds that are in there. And sometimes there'll be things that just kind of pique my interest enough that, I want to kind of check them out, like kale. I know, I'm one of those people that likes kale. And they had a couple of really interesting varieties of kale that were there that I had not seen before. And there were ones that were, very specific regionally in Scotland. So I got some of those seeds to try, and I'm just very excited to be trying some of these different varieties, especially now I'm in, a different climate as well. So there's lots of things that are there. And one of the wonderful things that I found through the exchange is gardeners are always willing to share the stories behind the seeds. There was some beautiful beans that I picked up through the exchange, and the gardener who shared those with me, shared the story behind the seeds as well, which was beautiful. And I love to hear those stories about the seeds. So anyway, I digress. This is not necessarily about the exchange, but we're talking about celeriac. So let's go back to celeriac, because you probably haven't heard about celeriac before this podcast episode. Celeriac is actually grown for its swollen roots. It's like a rutabaga or a swede in size, so it's kind of hefty. It's not a tennis ball size. It's supposed to be bigger. But it's actually kind of like a weird knotty root that looks like something out of a Lovecraft novel, rather than it being like a smooth and tapered root of a rutabaga. Like particularly on the bottom end of the celeriac is pretty gnarly with these, kind of tentacle like roots coming up. It has a mild celery flavour. It works very well in lots of different applications in the kitchen. It works great for making coleslaws. It works great in soups, casseroles. We use it in a mixed winter root veg roasted vegetable side that we do. So we'll do it with celeriac, rutabaga, turnips, beets, carrots, parsnips, and we just kind of chop them all up, toss them with some, olive oil, sprinkle some herbs on them, and stick it in the oven to roast, and we have that as a side. The leaves of celeriac can also be used to flavour dishes, so it's one of those plants that you can really use everything on, which I really, really love. I love getting, a bigger bang for my buck, especially for plants that are in the ground. And if you've got a small growing space, then having a plant that you can use within, multiple applications is really good. It's like, let's say, I go back to the cabbage versus, the kale or the collards, right? You can get more harvest from, collards and kale than you can a cabbage, because that cabbage, you'll just kind of take out that cabbage head. You might get an extra couple of cabbages if you leave that plant in, whereas, if you've got kale or something, or collards, you're able to keep coming back and harvesting multiple leaves. And I kind of feel celeriac's in that same boat, because I would take some of the leaves and things off, not too many, but, when I needed something to season in the kitchen and I didn't have celery growing or available, then I would go and, get the celeriac, or sometimes I would use lovage, the herb instead. But, it's one of those things that, is so underrated in the kitchen, and there's so much that you can do with it. I think one of the bigger ways that we use it, other than the roasted root veg, is I use it in a seasonal fall soup with leeks, potato, garlic, onions, and salt and pepper. It's very simple, but very delicious. You can also cut the root into like chips or small wedges or fries, and then you can bake those in the oven with a bit of olive oil, and then just serve them with like a twist of lemon, some salt and pepper. And that's also really good. And that's actually the first time that I ever had celeriac. I was introduced to it, must have been about, I don't know, sort of between 12 and 14, kind of early teens. And I was at my friend's house. It was her birthday, and her parents did these celeriac chips, because, England, right? So celeriac fries. And then I want to say we had like falafel as well. And I'd never eaten either of those things before. And they were delicious. And ever since that day, celeriac has been a favorite of mine ever since. And I'm pretty sure if I was to tell that friend, like, that's probably one of my biggest memories was her birthday and eating celeriac chips, she'd probably think I'm weird. And you guys might also think I'm weird at this point. But, you know, it's one of those things that, you know, I had a good experience with that vegetable, and I've wanted to, you know, try it more often and grow it. And that's kind of one of the cool things with, you know, having a garden. And celeriac in particular is one of those plants that grows well in cooler weather. It's pretty common in the UK. You know, it's common on allotments, in gardens, in grocery stores, farmers markets. But here in the US, it is really hard to find. It's difficult to find in the average grocery store. You might have to go to, you know, a more specialized store to find it. And even when you do find them, they're tiny. They're like the size of a tennis ball, and they're a ridiculous price. Celeriac is one of those vegetables that stores very well if you are looking for veggies that can be stored in a root cellar. And it's actually part of the celery family, or the Apum graveolens, if you're wanting the binomial name. It's so the celery family, and it's actually made up, the celery family itself is actually made up of 3 types. So you have the crisp, stalky celery that most of us have a love-hate relationship with. And of course, the price of celery right now is crazy. I mean, I remember when celery was $1.99 a bunch, and it's now anywhere from $3.49 to over $5 a bunch. It's crazy town. So if you're ever been thinking about a garden, now is definitely the time. But you also have smallage, or what's known as leaf celery, and that's grown for the leaves, used to season soups, stews, casseroles. And then you have celeriac, which is grown for its roots. And there's actually texts recording the use of the celery family of plants for more than 3,000 years ago. That's crazy. Like the celery family, or members of the celery family, have been domesticated in China since around the 5th century. And cultivated celery was first mentioned in a French publication in the 1600s. And the cultivation of celeriac was documented in Europe around the same time. So growing a garden offers you an opportunity to kind of grow a little bit of history, but it also offers you so many more opportunities to eat something different or grow something that's expensive or hard to get at the grocery store. I mean, homegrown heirloom tomatoes are always going to win against a grocery store tomato. And you know what? The other day I saw somebody who grew 1,500 varieties of tomatoes in raised beds with cattle panel trellis in a suburban garden, like maybe a third of an acre, I think they said it was. I was blown away. 1,500 varieties! Like, the most I have ever grown out of tomatoes is 50, and I have 3 acres now that I live rurally. I think the most that I got, like, just the number of plants in my suburban plot was about 24. You know, last year I grew about 150 tomato plants, and that was a lot. I can't even imagine having to plant out 1,500 varieties of just tomatoes. It's bananas. I mean, that's like garden goals right there for me. But yeah, like they grew so many different varieties, and how many of those varieties can you not get in a store? Probably most of them that person was growing. But a garden can offer that similar opportunity to grow things that you love but can't find. So for me, like, I try to grow things that I miss from growing up, like Savoy cabbage, celeriac, Granny's runner beans, a decent sized rutabaga that is not the size of a tennis ball. How about my other Granny's broad beans, right? Or just straight up organically grown greens that are not over $5 a bunch, for example. You don't need a huge space to get started with a garden either. If you're new to gardening, you're new to the podcast, take a look at some of the previous episodes and listen in to how to start your garden. And also come check us out on the Facebook group where, we've got lots of gardeners and we're all very willing to help each other out and share how we garden. So check us out on the Facebook group there. Now, let's talk about starting celeriac from seed. And I mentioned it in the last podcast episode too. Celeriac's one of those plants that can take a long time to germinate. It is slow to grow, and starting seeds indoors up to 10 weeks before your last frost date in spring is ideal. And you want to be able to transplant seedlings after the risk of frost has passed. Kind of like celery, it is a little hit and miss when it comes to getting it in the ground early season. I live in a zone 5/zone 4 area, so I want to make sure I'm planting it out after the risk of frost has passed. If you're in a more mild area, you might be able to get away with putting it out a little earlier, but make sure that you're using some floating row cover or some frost protection, and take the time to harden off your plants before you are planting them out. Now, as you're sowing your seeds, you want to be sowing them very thinly on a seed starting tray, on some seed starting mix, or try and use one seed per module if you're using the trays with individual modules like I do. They are teeny tiny seeds, so it can be a little fiddly to do just one seed on there. But when you do get them sown, you want to barely cover it with some sifted seed starting mix. You want to keep that soil moist, so use a humidity dome or clear plastic bag and put the trays in there to keep the humidity high to help those seeds germinate. But know that it could be a couple of weeks for those seeds just to germinate. And once those seeds have germinated, you need to get those under some grow lights pretty quickly, and you want to keep those lights low so the seedlings don't get leggy and spindly, because they will. And celeriac is a little finicky when it comes to temperature. The temperature needs to be warmer than 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, the plants are going to think that they're going through a winter and they're going through a vernalization cycle. And what that'll do is that'll actually trigger the flowering. So they'll focus on bolting and making seed rather than growing that tasty swollen root that we're looking for. So use a heat mat if your seed starting area is cool like it is at my house. But also think about, as those little seedlings are growing, where you're going to put them and keep them a little on the warmer side. Now, you're going to want to plan for about 2 to 3 celeriac plants per person for a growing season. If you find that you really like it, then maybe you can grow more. But I would stick with 2 or 3 celeriac plants per person, and know that not everything is going to make it through transplanting and, putting out into the garden. So maybe have a little bit of overage. But if it's your first time growing, then that's okay to just grow a small number of them just to see whether it is something that you like. Now, when your seedlings have their first set of true leaves, not the rounded baby leaves that you first see when a seed germinates, but when they get their true leaves, so the ones that look like they're big plant leaves, you're going to want to carefully transplant those into a bigger container, something like a 4-inch nursery pot, something larger, where your plants can keep growing into bigger plants ready for transplanting after that last frost, and have, plenty of room to grow without being disturbed too much. Celeriac is going to take about 110 to 120 days from transplanting to reach maturity, so you want to choose the best site to grow it in. Generally, it prefers a sunny location in the garden. It is going to tolerate some shade, so if you get a little shade in the afternoon or in the morning, it's going to tolerate a bit of that, but it's going to do better if it gets more sun than shade. The soil itself is going to need to be rich in compost or well-rotted manure. It likes to have a lot of humus in the soil, so make sure that you incorporate plenty of well-rotted compost or well-rotted manure, if that's what you're using, into that soil before you go ahead and transplant your plants. Celeriac is a pretty hungry crop and will need regular additions of compost as a mulch around the plants every couple of weeks, and will definitely appreciate some homemade liquid fertilizers made from comfrey or stinging nettle as well. And for those of you that are companion planting, you're probably thinking, how can I get more out of this garden bed than just the celeriac? Because as you're transplanting your celeriac plants, you're going to want to be giving them quite a bit of room to grow. And in some cases, you're going to be planting them, about a foot between plants, making sure there's plenty of, air movement around those plants. So that's quite a lot of space, even as they are small, but you've got to account for that root to be swelling up. And you also want to give yourself plenty of space to be able to kind of heal up around those roots and cover those roots with some soil. So give them plenty of space to grow. Now, you can definitely use some companion planting techniques and intercropping to get a bit more from that garden space. So early in the season, you can have things like peas. English peas work very well. Also, they're adding nitrogen into the soil, which is giving those plants an extra boost of food, right? You could also use lettuce and spinach, and those work well as companions early in the growing season. But you want to avoid things like squashes, pumpkins, melons, and cucumbers near your celery root. Like those groups of plants do not work well together. You could also look at planting flowers nearby, or a green manure like buckwheat or a soil building mix to provide a bit of a buffer between your celeriac and other garden plants if you're wanting. And of course, the good thing about growing green manures is you can kind of come through, you can cut them down, and then you can use them as a mulch to protect that soil. Your celery root plants are pretty shallow, like the roots of them don't go down super deep, and that means that they can dry out quite quickly in the summer. A lack of moisture is going to lead to having tough plants. It can stop them growing, and they can die off kind of quickly if they don't get enough moisture. So you want to keep your plants watered regularly. You want to use a thick mulch to help conserve the moisture in the soil. And when you're weeding, you want to be really careful, especially around your celeriac plants, because you want to avoid damaging those roots of the celeriac because they're so shallow. So if you're using a hoe to weed, then you don't want to be going down, like a couple of inches or anything like that, because you can end up like chopping those roots of your celeriac and then causing that plant to have some problems. So, mulching thickly is not only going to help keep that water in the soil, but it's also going to help reduce the weeds and help blanch that swollen root of the celeriac plant too. So there's a couple of options for you. Now, the good thing, of course, is if you're using lettuce and you're kind of growing lettuces sort of in between the rows and around, lettuces are going to help kind of shade that soil as well. So there is an option there, but you don't want too many things growing in and around your celeriac to kind of compete with the nutrients, right? Celeriac's pretty hungry. It is going to, take up as much of those nutrients as it can out of that soil. So, using mulch, and particularly mulches that are going to break down and feed that soil as well, is going to help your plants grow better. In terms of pests and diseases, though, celeriac is mostly trouble-free. It can stay in the ground until after a light frost, but a hard frost is going to kill those plants. So you're going to want to make sure that you get those up and out of the ground before a hard frost is coming. And then you're really just kind of chopping the roots and chopping the tops to be able to store them. And there's lots of different ways that you can store them. You can store them in, damp sand, kind of like a root cellar kind of deal. You can store them in the fridge. You can, prep them and put them in the freezer. Or you can, cook things that that you like and then freeze those for a quick meal. There's lots of different things that you can do with celeriac. Now, if you're wanting to save some seed from your celeriac, know that a hard frost is going to kill the plants. So if you're in an area with a harsh winter, you are definitely going to be thinking either of lifting those roots to store and then check them throughout their storage and remove any that are, kind of dying off or looking diseased or whatnot. Or you could look at keeping them in the ground using heavy mulching with straw, covering the plants with some frost protection and stuff to help keep that winter weather off them, so they can grow on the next year for seed. So celeriac, just like any member of the celery family, is a biennial. So it's going to produce seed in that second year, and it needs this vernalization period of temperatures of like less than 55 degrees for at least 6 weeks to trigger that seed starting mindset of the plant. And one of the things to bear in mind is it's likely to cross with celery and other, members of the celery family. So if you're wanting to produce seed of, celery, leaf celery, or celeriac, then you are going to want to figure out how you can protect from cross-pollinating between them. You're going to want to either grow out only one at a time. So maybe one year you're growing, I don't know, Ventura celery one year, and you want to save seed from that in the following year. Well, maybe whilst you are growing the seeds for your Ventura celery, you are growing celery roots or celeriac that year, and then the following year you can save the seed from the celeriac instead. You want to kind of think about that, or use some kind of isolation caging or something to help reduce some cross-pollination that is going on there. But it's one of those things that although it can be a little daunting to save seed from a biennial crop, it's actually very rewarding to see, because the plants get so much bigger, and they put on these beautiful displays of gorgeous flowers that pollinators and stuff go bananas for. So if you ever wanted to kind of bring some pollinators to your garden, then letting some plants go to seed and saving the seed from those is definitely a great way to do that. But I would love to hear from you. Are you growing celeriac in your garden? What varieties are you trying? Let me know over in the Facebook group. And until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I'll see you next week.